peer review, analyzing differing methodologies at media studies and communication journals. Just as a quick overview, I'll start by providing some context as to why I chose this topic, an introduction of the existing literature, overview of my research questions, the methodological approach that I took, and then I'll dive into the particulars of this investigation. For some context, I was introduced to the world of academic publishing as a first-year student in the Clark Honors College, and much of my coursework related to or relied on peer-reviewed scholarly works. So I wondered what made peer review more trustworthy or legitimate than popular science articles or other news articles. And so this topic kind of circulated in my brain space for about a year before I decided to pursue it as my undergraduate thesis topic. So in the fall of 2022, I took the first of a two-sequence course in Honors College thesis orientation. And in that class, I refined my ideas through class discussions and personal reflection. And then over the course of the year, I continued to grapple with my ideas and figure out what kind of questions I was working with. And then in spring 2022, I took a class with Dr. Sutherland, and that's when I asked her to be my primary thesis advisor. And then I was kind of working on the project ever since. So just as an introduction, upon starting this research, I found that the advent of the internet expanded digital publishing opportunities in a previously entirely text-based industry. So before the late 1990s and early 2000s, the academic publishing industry was almost exclusively print-based, which was expensive and time-consuming for all parties involved in that process. So while commercial publishers started grappling with this transition, a group of scholars in media studies and communication took matters into their own hands and created journals independent of commercial publishers, one of which was interviewed for this investigation. And although many of the journals that arose at the turn of the century related to or relied on traditional peer review methods, that being the double-blind process, a few journals experimented with alternative methods. So this investigation largely builds on ongoing conversations in media studies and communications about, along with the scholarly community more broadly. There's a lot of discussions going on in scientific fields about what open science means for the future of the academy and what open access publishing looks like in their particular fields. But this particular project assesses the degree to which peer review methods differ under disparate ownership orientations, that being not-for-profit and for-profit at media studies and communications journals. So here I've outlined what the existing literature does and does not do. So much of the research I consulted at the beginning of this project came from what was originally a cinema journal, but is now the Society, or the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. And so these articles came from a group of scholars, namely Jason Mattel, Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Shane Denson, Eric Snowden, and more. And so this was my first introduction to the debate over what the future of the academy would look like in this particular field. And so these texts informed the origin of the debate while situating it as a media studies and communication topic and under like a digital humanities focus. So these scholars also questioned the efficacy of double-blind review, as multiple of them were working on efforts to integrate alternative methods into the industry. So then as I continued my preliminary research, found that other scholars in related social scientific disciplines had published works analyzing various attempts to restructure the academic publishing ecosystem. Namely, if you're looking at the bibliography, Even Gray have a great piece on that, and other works like Wakely et al. Study and Gupta's piece, along with metrics from Google Scholar, support the notion that scholarly success is not entirely bound to disciplinary or to journal affiliation, those affiliations being with learned societies and or commercial publishers. And so while existing works in the subfield focus on an array of related topics, there are no existing structured qualitative research projects that focus on the relationship between peer review and journal ownership across disciplines and within media studies and communication. Additionally, none of these use a critical political economy lens to approach the topic, which I do. So see, these are some of the research questions that were guiding my project. The first being, how do peer review processes at academic journals in media studies and communication differ under disparate ownership orientations? How do these differences affect emerging contributions to the media studies field? Does journal affiliation, ownership, and editorial size and scope contribute to disciplinary impact? What does compensation look like at journals operating under contrasting ownership orientations? And how do editors, authors, and reviewers feel about the existing system? To pursue these research questions, I chose to use semi-structured phenomenological interviews. And so for those unfamiliar with the term phenomenology, which is kind of a mouthful to say, it derives from long-standing philosophical discussions that arose after World War I. And so it's a quote from Eagleton, which is quoted in the text I used to kind of guide my design of this investigation, that says, the social order of European capitalism had been shaken to its roots by the carnage of war and its turbulent aftermath. The ideologies on which that order had customarily depended, the cultural values by which it ruled, were also in deep turmoil. Science seemed to have dwindled to a sterile positivism, a myopic obsession with the categorizing of facts. Philosophy appeared torn between such positivism on the one hand and an indefensible subjectivism on the other. Forms of relativism and irrationalism were rampant, and the art reflected this bewildering loss of bearings. So this is pulled from a text that Thomas Grunwald wrote in 2016, focusing on, or it's called A Phenomenological Research Design Illustrated. So anyways, as Grunwald describes, phenomenological research attempts to accurately describe the possible phenomenon, refraining from any pre-given framework, but remaining true to its facts. So essentially allowing the participant involved in the interview to guide the conversation, to understand the phenomenon on a deeper level without imposing my subjective opinion. So practically, this method is carried out through semi-structured interviews in which participants are asked a series of questions, but the interviewer is encouraged to intervene with follow-up questions on related ideas throughout the conversation. So for this study, I conducted 11 60 to 90-minute Zoom interviews with editors-in-chief from various journals in media studies and communication. I initially sent out I was in my email the other day, looking through all the emails I sent to try and count how many journals I originally had reached out to, and I think I lost count, but it was over 30. So still a third possible responses was really good. So I'm happy about that. So for the data analysis portion of this, I transcribed all my interviews using Otter AI, and then I analyzed using Dedoose, which for those of you in the room who aren't researchers, is a qualitative data analysis software that's used to basically thematically or descriptively code different excerpts into different thematic codes. So I used a descriptive coding method to categorize interview excerpts under corresponding codes. Okay, so the two following data visualizations display each journal interviewed for this study's affiliation with commercial publishers and or learned societies, and then figure 1 ascertains these categories specifically as journal funding sources, which they are. So this was used as a reference for me throughout the process, because even though I conducted these interviews and I know all of them pretty darn well now, I still had to go back and remember, like, okay, who's affiliated with what and what's their profile as an editor. But yeah, this is a little bit of context. And then building off that, table 2 describes the composition of journal specialization versus generalization. So as you can see, 36% of the journals I interviewed were specialized journals. And so specialized journals kind of means that the content of the journal is specific to a particular ideological or research framework. So for example, I interviewed a number of journals that self-described as feminist journals. And so when they were sifting through submissions, one thing that was really important to them was making sure that that submissions had a uniquely feminist approach to the research, or we're discussing uniquely feminist topics. And on the other hand, generalized journals are field specific or discipline specific. So an example of that would be like the International Journal of Communication, which publishes a range of theoretically oriented topics that fall into the category of media studies and communications. Then the table 3 shows journal acceptance rates and annual submissions for the journals participating in this study. As you can see, there's kind of a range, but with the lowest rate being 13% and the highest rate being about 35%. And also, as you can see, the number of submissions per journal is also pretty drastically different. Okay, so I just wanted to define a little bit what the traditional peer review process is. So upon starting this project and conducting the interviews, multiple participants claimed that their peer review processes were pretty standard or pretty traditional. And so then upon asking what their peer review process was, I found that they used the double-blind process, which is what I assumed was the standard or traditional method in the field. But the double-blind process essentially means that authors and reviewers' identities are blind or unknown to one another. And so this process is thought to eliminate subjectivity in the review process by discouraging reviewers from relying on their individual predisposition towards a particular person's professional status, nationality, or other demographic considerations. And so this is a diagram, I suppose, that I created that outlines the peer review process as deduced from the interviews that I conducted. I'm not going to go through every single step of this because that would be time consuming, but it is in the written copy if people want to look at it more closely. So yeah, each journal's workflow is also unique. This is a generalized overview of the process and does not speak to what each journal's process is. And also, I would say the extensiveness of the process differs based off journals' affiliations and resources. So I kind of split my thesis into 2 primary sections with a number of corresponding subsections. So the first section that I'm going to get into is titled Combating Norms, and it focuses on the ways in which journals are strategically combating industry norms. The first way that many journals combat norms is through alternative review methods. Open review lies on one end of the spectrum. So the journal that I interviewed who's using open review declined to be anonymous for the study. And so that journal is in transition, otherwise known as Journal F. But they publish videographic and moving image studies oriented works. They publish video essays. And so procedurally, scholars will submit their video essay alongside an author's statement. And then the editorial team assigns the piece to a reviewer with the author's name attached. And then the reviewer reviews and sends the author back a signed review. And then the author and reviewer collaborate to discuss and improve the project. So Jason Mattel was also the editor I interviewed for this from this journal, and he declined to be anonymous. And so one thing that he said that really stuck out was I'm going to read a quote from him. I really like open review because it turns reviews into a community conversation. You know who you're talking to. Anonymous peer review does not feel like a good conversation. It feels like you're being judged, you're being assessed. And it's really frustrating when you get comments back and think, I don't know where this person is coming from. And it's literally true. I don't even know if they're in my field. So that's on open reviews on one side of the spectrum. On the other side is triple blind. Journal A uses a triple blind review process. And procedurally, it's fairly similar to double blind review. The only difference being that under a triple blind model, the editor, who is the person assigning submissions to a reviewer, also does not know the author's identity. So that is thought to remove an additional layer or an additional level of what could contribute to bias within the process. Yeah. So another way that journals combat industry norms is through mentorship. Numerous participants discussed the value of mentorship as an almost like ideologically informed value. And so when I say ideologically informed value, I'm referring to various journals that are specialized, for example, being a feminist journal. If mentorship is something that aligns with both their ideological values as a journal and of their specialization and aligns with how they want to conduct the review process, then they will include aspects of their ideological values within the communication to authors and reviewers. So this is a great quote that I like from Olivia, who is from Journal G. Just to point out, she says, when I send out requests to reviewers, I explicitly include a line that states this is one of the values we uphold, and we would like our reviewers to embrace that. So essentially, that just means that the feedback should be helpful rather than self-promoting, and it should critique the argument, not the author. Another way that journal editors and journals in media studies and communication are combating norms is through publishing platforms. There are essentially two types of publishing platforms in media studies and communication, and I can't speak to the field more broadly or to the industry more broadly, but I suppose that they could be the two dominant types of publishing platforms in academic publishing industry. And so one of which is proprietary platforms. So proprietary platforms are owned by commercial publishers. They're only accessible to the journals owned by the publisher and largely paywalled depending on journals' open access policies. And the back-end technological infrastructure supporting those platforms is also not publicly accessible. So it's unclear if and how algorithms on these platforms may contribute to content variation and reviewer selection. And so I say content variation and reviewer selection because many of the attributes on these platforms are like integrated reviewer recommendation search boxes. So it'll say, like, when you make a profile, for example, on a publishing project management software, it'll ask you put in a few keywords of what kind of work you do and what kind of work you're interested in reviewing. And so then there have been questions circulating, and one of the things discussed in many of the interviews I had was if these project management publishing platforms have some sort of algorithm to recommend certain scholars more frequently than others, and if and how that's affecting content variation. On the other hand, open source platforms rely on GNU general public licensing, and that is openly and publicly available for both personal and commercial uses. So two examples of not-for-profit open source platforms that were of interviewees for this project are Open Library of the Humanities, which is based in the UK, funded by multiple philanthropic donations, and the European Research Council, alongside Open Journal Systems, which is housed at Simon Fraser University in Canada, and their university's public knowledge project. So these platforms, because the underlying backend software is publicly available, it's clear what their procedures are, and it's clear what the backend technology looks like. Another way in which journals combat industry norms is through publishing services. One of these ways is through discretionary open access. So commercial publishers 1 and 2, which for those who read the thesis are what I generically call the two main publishers that were of the journals that were interviewed for this study. So they both have what I refer to as discretionary open access policies, which allow journal editors to ask their publisher essentially, if certain articles or issues can be open access based on relevance, like what's going on in the world, things like that. And that's at no charge to authors, editors, or the affiliated organizations. Another way is through geographically determined open access. So here I have a quote from Alec of Journal C, whose journal is publishing Corporate Publisher 2. So Corporate Publisher 2 specifically provides open access to authors publishing from less economically developed countries. And I think that is specific to their entity. Finally, journals are combating norms through publishing services by offering additional forums or outlets for authors to publish. So Journal A and Journal I both offer multiple platforms. Journal A offers 3 additional publishing forums, 2 of which don't rely on peer review. And both Journal A and Journal I also put an emphasis on book reviews, which both discussed as being almost archaic in our emerging digital era, especially in the humanities. So they were both reticent to promote book reviews as a part of their journal's offering. So now we'll get to section 2, which I titled Structural Forces, which focuses on the influences that put pressure on journals. Learned societies are an integral part of academic publishing industry. Generally speaking, journals need resources, and learned societies have them alongside publishers, universities, etc. So without support from one or more of these entities, the editorial teams that ultimately do the work to publish journals do not get compensated in any way for the work that they do. And unlike commercial publishers, learned societies do have procedural oversight over the journal that they own and run. So learned societies can influence editorial teams, like the makeup of editorial teams, alongside the focus of the journal, affiliated projects, and the structure and funding model, and more. Learned societies, generally speaking, also do not play a role in the article selection and publication process. That is almost exclusively up to the editor-in-chief and associate editors. Journals not affiliated with learned societies but owned by a commercial publisher discussed fears over being overthrown should they ever choose to leave the commercial publisher, as the commercial publisher has the rights to the title of the journal and essentially owns the journal, even though the people putting out the journal are those on the editorial team. They don't have ownership over the journal, the commercial publisher does. And independent journals that aren't owned by a commercial publisher or affiliated with the learned society rely on individuals, institutions, and/or editorial boards for legitimacy. Professional pressures are another major impediment in the industry. So I thought I'd include a few ways that professional pressures affect both authors, reviewers, and editors. So journal shopping, which is the topic of this quote on the screen right now, is when authors submit the same manuscript to multiple related journals, hoping that their work will be accepted by one. And this is really risky because it's likely that the journals will send the manuscript to the same reviewers or similar reviewers, and those reviewers will then be reluctant to read or review an article, especially if they've already recommended it as a rejection to a different journal. And so scholars oftentimes do this out of desperation when seeking publication as a means to achieve professional success. Another way is through what's called quid pro quo. So there's kind of two sides to quid pro quo. This was described by multiple editors, when important people, for example, like the director of a learned society that sponsors a journal, submits work to the journal. Editors expressed discomfort when receiving submissions from important people like that, because they're the ones who field public criticism about the submissions and about the articles published in the journal, and they don't want to get pushback, or they don't want readers to feel uncomfortable by the fact that the director of the journal just got published in it. Another way is when journal editors send works to a journal, and then that journal's editor sends a submission to their journal. They feel a little bit uncomfortable not knowing if they should send it out to reviewers or if they should desk reject it. It's kind of this weird quid pro quo, like, I submit to you, you submit to me, and then we'll both be happy. But it definitely is a big source of discomfort among editors. Reviewer retention is another major issue in academic publishing. In fact, I think an entire dissertation could probably be written on reviewers. But reviewers are scholars, mentors, educators, and people, and they can only handle so much. So it's often difficult for editors to recruit and retain reviewers, considering their other responsibilities and the fact that this labor is ultimately unpaid. Another major finding within this research was the outsourcing of editorial labor. So commercial publishers 1 and 2 have started outsourcing copy editing labor to firms in India and Southeast Asia, according to interviews that I conducted. And editors and authors expressed dissatisfaction with the copy editing quality and discomfort with the reliance on what was often referred to as cheap labor, when there are many possible people in the United States or elsewhere who could be conducting that labor high quality, but the commercial publisher is choosing to do it for choosing a less economically disadvantageous way. So there's also evidence that commercial publisher 1 uses an integrated AI tool to automate copy editing labor, which likewise led to dissatisfaction amongst editors of those journals. Next steps. Once I'm finished with this defense right now, I will begin editing and refining this draft. Potentially would like to publish it somewhere. I know the Oregon Undergraduate Research Journal publishes theses, so I've thought about that. I also want to conduct further research on the outsourcing of editorial labor and hopefully generate a publication from that, just because I think it's really interesting. And then I also want to refine a handbook that I made last term, because a faculty member in the SOJC asked if it could potentially be used for graduate students as like a guide book for publishing in the field. And then I'm also just more generally excited to continue researching the political economy of academic publishing, hopefully expand my participant pool in future endeavors, and then experiment with survey methods, investigate the economic apparatus. I really want to interview people from commercial publishers, although I have a feeling they would be reluctant to speak with me. Yeah, and then my concluding thoughts. The future of scholarly publishing, I think, remains hopeful. There are many journals that are publishing high quality work. Journals continue to advocate for universal open access, which puts pressure on commercial publishers to eliminate the financial barriers, restricting them from entirely publishing open access. And also it was really refreshing to find that journal editors ultimately have almost complete control over the editorial process. I came into this with skepticism that commercial publishers would have quite a lot of say over the editorial process and the publication timeline, but I found that really they essentially just have the money. Non-proprietary alternatives are also thriving with support from NGOs, universities, federal agencies, and other entities. And the above considerations must also be addressed in order to decrease the professional pressures and reinforce academic legitimacy.